Before you think your next thought, try choosing what it will be. Not the topic in some loose sense, not a category you'll let your mind wander into, but the actual thought, word for word, image for image, the precise shape it will take in the next half second. Try to specify it in advance, the way you might specify the next word you're about to type. Go ahead. Choose it. You can't. And the strange thing isn't that you can't do it perfectly. The strange thing is that the moment you try, you discover there was never anyone in the driver's seat to begin with. You reach for the lever that steers your own mind and your hand closes on nothing. A thought arrives to tell you that no thought can be chosen in advance, and that thought itself was not chosen either. It simply showed up, uninvited, doing the job you asked it to do, and you have no idea where it came from or how it knew what you needed. This is the strangest fact about being a mind, and it's so strange that most of us never notice it because noticing it requires the very faculty that's in question. We walk around all day assuming we are the authors of our inner lives, the source from which our thoughts spring, the eye that does the thinking. It feels obvious. It feels like the most obvious thing in the world, more obvious than the existence of the chair you're sitting on or the day of the week. And yet the moment you actually look for the author, actually go searching in the place where the thoughts come from, you find something closer to an empty stage with actors wandering on and off, delivering lines nobody wrote for them, and you, the audience, sitting in the dark, applauding as if you'd been the one performing all along. So where do your thoughts actually come from? Not metaphorically. Not as a philosophical parlor trick. Literally, where does the next thought in your head come from, and who, if anyone, is doing the producing? This question sounds like it should have an easy answer. It doesn't. It has occupied some of the sharpest minds in the history of philosophy and, more recently, some of the most careful minds in neuroscience, and the answer they keep arriving at, from wildly different directions, using wildly different tools, is unsettling in a very particular way. It isn't that thoughts come from nowhere. It's that they come from somewhere you don't have access to, somewhere behind a curtain you didn't know was there, and what you experience as thinking is closer to reading the output of a process you never see running. Let's start where the strangeness is loudest, the intrusive thought. Almost everyone has had one. You're standing at the edge of a train platform, waiting for the train, thinking about nothing in particular, maybe replaying a conversation from earlier in the day, and suddenly, with no warning and no invitation, a thought arrives: what if I jumped? Not because you want to jump. Not because you're suicidal, or reckless, or losing your grip on reality. The thought simply appears, fully formed, vivid, uninvited, like a stranger who has let himself into your house and is now standing in your kitchen. You didn't summon him. You don't want him there. And yet there he is, and there's nothing you can do about the fact of his arrival, only about what you do next. This happens to people constantly in forms far more mundane than the platform example. You're holding a knife, cutting vegetables, and a thought flashes through about what it would be like to cut yourself. You're at a funeral, and an inappropriate joke surfaces from nowhere, fully formed, funny in a way that horrifies you. You're driving on the highway, and for a fraction of a second you picture yourself jerking the wheel into oncoming traffic. You're holding a newborn, someone else's or your own, and a flash of violent imagery cuts through the tenderness of the moment, gone as fast as it came, leaving behind nothing but a residue of shame that has nothing whatsoever to do with anything you actually want. None of this means anything about who you are or what you want. Clinical psychology has a name for this phenomenon precisely because it is so common and so universally misunderstood: intrusive thoughts. Researchers who study them have found that upwards of 90% of people report having had thoughts of this kind, thoughts that are violent, sexual, blasphemous, or otherwise completely at odds with their values, thoughts they would never act on and are in fact horrified to have had. The thoughts are not symptoms of secret desire. They are symptoms of nothing at all except the basic architecture of a mind that generates content faster than it can vet it. What makes intrusive thoughts such a useful entry point into this whole subject is that they strip away, for a moment, the comfortable ambiguity that surrounds ordinary thinking. Most of the time, when a thought arrives that fits neatly with your self-image, you have no reason to ask where it came from. It feels like yours because it agrees with you, and agreement is mistaken constantly for authorship. But an intrusive thought produces exactly the same phenomenology of arrival, the same suddenness, the same completeness, the same total absence of a visible drafting process, while being met with total disavowal instead of quiet acceptance. That contrast is diagnostic. It tells you that the feeling of "this is mine" is not actually tracking anything about how the thought was produced. It's tracking something closer to your reaction to the contents applied after the fact, dressed up as a judgment about origin. Two thoughts generated by the identical process, arriving through the identical channel, and only one of them gets stamped authored by me purely on the basis of whether you like what it says. If authorship were real in the way it feels real, it shouldn't be this easy to fool. There's a particular cruelty built into how intrusive thoughts tend to work, one that clinicians who treat obsessive-compulsive disorder know intimately, because it's the exact mechanism that turns an ordinary, universal mental event into a disorder for a small percentage of people. The mind that is horrified by an intrusive thought often responds to that horror by trying to suppress the thought, to push it back down, to make absolutely sure it never happens again. And this strategy again and again backfires, because trying not to think about something requires, as a precondition, monitoring for that very thing. You have to keep checking whether the forbidden thought has returned, and the checking process itself keeps the thought's neural pathways active and primed. Psychologists sometimes demonstrate a version of this with a simple exercise: try, for the next 10 seconds, not to think about a white bear. Almost everyone fails immediately, and often finds that white bears become more persistent, not less, precisely because of the effort at suppression. This is worth mentioning here because it reveals something important about the relationship between the conscious I and the thoughts that arrive in it. You don't even have reliable control over which thoughts you can successfully banish, let alone which thoughts get generated in the first place. If authorship meant anything close to what it feels like it means, this kind of failure should be impossible. A novelist can simply choose not to write a sentence. Whatever is producing your thoughts is not taking instructions of that kind, not reliably, and sometimes not at all. But sit with what that means for a moment, because it is more radical than it first appears. If a thought can appear in your consciousness that you did not want, did not choose, do not endorse, and would in fact pay a great deal of money to have never had, then the naive picture of yourself as the author of your thoughts has already collapsed, at least in this one case. An author does not write sentences he disavows the instant they appear on the page. An author does not sit in horror watching his own pen. But this is exactly the relationship many people have with their own intrusive thoughts: horror, disowning, and immediate and forceful, that is not me, directed at something that just occurred, uninvited, inside the very mind that is doing the disowning. There's a further layer to this that most people never think through, because the topic is uncomfortable enough that most people stop at that was disturbing and move on with their day. Consider what an intrusive thought actually demonstrates about the speed and independence of the process generating it. The thought about jumping from the platform is not vague. It is not a fuzzy impulse or a general mood. It typically arrives as something close to a complete, specific, sensory-rich mental event, an image, sometimes, of the fall itself, or the precise phrasing of the idea, fully grammatical, fully formed, ready to be reported in words the instant it appears. Whatever system produced that thought did an enormous amount of work to produce it. It selected a scenario, rendered it in enough detail to be recognizable and disturbing, attached it to the correct context, the platform, the edge, the drop, and delivered the finished product to consciousness in what feels like zero time. No conscious process you're aware of performed any of that construction. You didn't sit there thinking, let me consider frightening scenarios involving this platform and then select the best one. The whole thing arrived pre-built, the way a meal arrives at a table in a restaurant. You see the finished plate, you never see the kitchen, and the finished plate gives you no information whatsoever about how the ingredients were selected, prepared, and combined. Behind the door you don't have access to. Here is the deeper puzzle hiding underneath the surface one. If you can definitely say that thought is not really me about an intrusive thought, if you can draw a clean line between the thought and the self that experiences it, then what entitles you to draw the opposite line around your other thoughts? What lets you say of the thought you're having right now, the one that feels reasonable and considered and yours, that one is me? Both thoughts arrived the same way. Both simply appeared in consciousness, unbidden, assembled by some process you had no access to and no say in. The only difference is that one of them horrifies you and the other doesn't. But horror is not authorship. Feeling a kinship with a thought after it arrives is not the same as having written it. This is the first crack in the wall, and it's worth pausing on before we go further, because everything that follows is really just this same crack, examined from different angles, by different thinkers across nearly 3 centuries. The wall is the idea that there is a stable, continuous you sitting somewhere behind your thoughts, generating them the way a novelist generates sentences deliberately, with intention, word by chosen word. The crack is the plain observation that this is not what it feels like from me inside once you actually look, and it is definitely not what the science shows when it looks at the machinery underneath. The first person to drive a serious philosophical wedge into this crack did so more than 250 years before anyone had a functional MRI machine or a word for intrusive thought. His name was David Hume, and the argument he made is one of the most quietly devastating passages in the history of philosophy, precisely because it doesn't rely on any exotic thought experiment. It relies on nothing more than careful attention. Hume's method was simple to describe and almost impossible to actually do, which is why it still matters. He said, forget the theories. Forget what philosophers and theologians have told you about the soul, the self, the immortal essence that supposedly sits behind your experience like a pilot behind the controls of a plane. Instead, just look. Turn your attention inward and examine what is actually there, moment to moment, and report only what you find, nothing more. And what did Hume find when he did this? In his words, whenever he entered most intimately into what he called himself, he always stumbled on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. He could never catch himself at any time without a perception, and he could never observe anything but the perception. When his perceptions were removed for any time, as by sound sleep, so long was he insensible of himself, and he could truly say he did not exist. And even after death, he suspected, if all his perceptions were removed, he would be entirely annihilated, and could not conceive what more was required to make him a perfect non-entity. This is a stunning claim, and it's worth translating out of its 18th century phrasing, because the substance of it is more radical than the language makes it sound. Hume is saying, I looked for myself. I looked for the I that supposedly has all these experiences, the owner of the thoughts, the audience behind the theatre. And I never found it. I only ever found the show. I found the heat and the cold, the color and the sound, the love and the hate, one after another, a procession of perceptions, but never once did I catch the perceiver standing apart from the perceptions, watching them the way a person watches a movie. There was no movie theater. There was only the movie. From this observation, Hume built what has come to be called the bundle theory of the self. On this view, what we call the self is not a single, unified thing that exists prior to and independent of experience, some metaphysical peg on which all our thoughts and feelings are hung. It is nothing more than a bundle, or a collection, of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity, and are in a perpetual flux and movement. The mind, Hume wrote, is a kind of theatre, where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. But, and this is the crucial part, the part people tend to skip over, there is no single thing that persists through all this. There is no stage in any literal sense, no fixed backdrop against which the play occurs. The comparison to a theatre must not mislead us, Hume warns. The successive perceptions constitute the mind. We have not the most distant notion of the place where these scenes are represented, or of the materials of which it is composed. Read that again, because it's the whole argument in one sentence. The perceptions are not happening to the mind. The perceptions are the mind. There is no additional thing over and above the parade of thoughts and sensations that the parade is happening to. Take away the parade, and there's nothing left, not even an empty stage, because the stage was never there in the first place. It was a grammatical illusion generated by the fact that our language requires a subject for every verb. We say I think, and the grammar of the sentence tricks us into believing there must be an I that does the thinking, the way there's a baker who does the baking. But grammar is not a reliable guide to metaphysics. It is raining doesn't require an it that does the raining. Maybe I think doesn't require an I that does the thinking either. Maybe there is just the thinking, and I is a story we tell about the thinking after the fact, stitched together from memory and habit and the deep, evolutionarily useful illusion of continuity. It's worth dwelling a little longer on how strange this claim actually is, because it's easy to nod along with it in the abstract and then quietly slide back into the ordinary assumption a moment later. Hume is not saying that the self is small or weak or hard to see clearly. He is saying that when you search for it using the only tool available, introspection, direct attention turned inward, you come back empty-handed every single time, without exception, no matter how carefully or how many times you look. This is different from failing to see something that is nonetheless there, the way you might fail to see a virus without a microscope. Hume's claim is closer to failing to find a country on a map that you have already searched in full, at every scale, with every instrument you own. At some point, persistent failure to find something, using every method available, starts to look less like a limitation of the search and more like evidence about what's actually there to be found. Hume was careful to note that other people might have a different experience, that perhaps some other person does perceive something within themselves resembling a simple, continuous, self-identical self. But he doubted it, and he offered a challenge that still has bite. If such a person exists, Hume admits he can no longer reason with them on this point, but everyone else, he wagers, will recognize themselves in his description, a collection, a bundle, a heap of different perceptions, united only by certain relations, and falsely supposed to be endowed with perfect simplicity and identity. The relations he has in mind are not nothing. He points specifically to resemblance, contiguity, and above all causation as the psychological glue that makes the bundle feel unified, the way a river feels like one continuous thing even though the water composing it is entirely different from one moment to the next. You are not the water. You are the pattern the water happens to make as it moves, and the pattern only looks like a persisting object because memory keeps generating a story that links this moment's water to last moment's water over and over, fast enough that the seams never show. This is where Hume's observation starts to rhyme uncannily with the intrusive thought example we started with. If the self really is nothing but a bundle of perceptions succeeding each other, with no author standing behind them selecting which ones get to appear, then the fact that an unwanted, horrifying thought can simply materialize in the bundle is not an anomaly. It's the rule, momentarily made visible. Most of the time, the bundle produces thoughts that feel congenial, thoughts we are happy to call mine, and so we never notice that we didn't choose them either. We just don't object to their arrival the way we object to the intrusive ones. The intrusive thought is disturbing precisely because it reveals the mechanism that was running the whole time, quietly, underneath thoughts we liked well enough not to interrogate. You can test this for yourself right now using something close to Hume's own method. Try to catch the moment before your next thought arrives. Not the thought itself, the moment before it, the gap, the space in which you might imagine a chooser standing ready to select. Sit in that gap and watch. What you'll find, if you watch closely enough and honestly enough, is that there is no gap. There is no waiting room where thoughts line up for approval before being admitted to consciousness. There is simply the previous thought and then, discontinuously, the next one arriving already complete, already dressed, with no visible seam where a chooser might have intervened. You do not watch yourself select your next thought from a menu. You watch it appear, the way you watch a light turn on. And then, a half-second later, memory and narrative kick in, and you tell yourself the story that you thought it, that it was yours, that you're the author. But you were not present for the composition. You were only present for the delivery. Hume's insight sat in the philosophical literature for over a century before someone came along and pushed it even further, and did so with a violence and a rhetorical force that Hume, careful and measured philosopher that he was, never allowed himself. That someone was Friedrich Nietzsche, and where Hume dismantled the self with the patience of an accountant going through receipts, Nietzsche dismantled it with something closer to contempt not for the self exactly, but for the philosophers who had spent centuries insisting it was the one thing they could be absolutely certain of. Nietzsche's target was Descartes, and specifically Descartes' famous cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. This sentence has served, for nearly 400 years, as the bedrock of a certain kind of philosophy, the one indubitable starting point from which everything else could supposedly be built. Descartes wanted to doubt everything doubtable, to strip away every belief that could conceivably be false, and see what was left standing at the bottom. He doubted the existence of the physical world, the reliability of his senses, even the basic laws of mathematics, imagining an evil demon capable of deceiving him about anything at all. But one thing, he decided, could not be doubted, the fact that he was doubting. Doubting is a form of thinking, and thinking requires a thinker. Therefore, even if everything else about him was an illusion, the fact that he existed as a thinking thing was certain. I think, therefore I am. Nietzsche thought this was, in a certain sense, a kind of intellectual cheating, and he said so with characteristic bluntness in Beyond Good and Evil. He pointed out that Descartes' famous inference smuggles in an enormous, unexamined assumption. The sentence I think already contains, hidden inside its grammar, a claim that has not been earned, the claim that there is an I that does the thinking, as opposed to the thinking simply occurring on its own. Nietzsche's alternative formulation, deliberately awkward in a way that makes the point, was something closer to a thought comes when it wishes, and not when I wish. He insisted that it is a falsification of the facts to say that the subject I is the condition of the predicate think. Something thinks, but that this something is precisely the famous old I is, to put it mildly, only an assumption, an assertion, and above all not an immediate certainty. It's worth pausing to appreciate just how audacious this move is coming from Nietzsche, because it takes aim at the one sentence in the entire Western philosophical tradition that had been treated, for the better part of 2 centuries, as immune to this kind of doubt. Descartes doubted the existence of his own body. He doubted the reliability of mathematics. He doubted whether the external world existed at all, entertaining, in one of philosophy's most famous thought experiments, the possibility that an evil demon of the utmost power and cunning was employing all his energies to deceive him about literally everything he perceived. And having doubted all of that, Descartes still believed he had found solid ground, a single proposition that could not be shaken loose no matter how hard the demon tried. Even a deceived thinker has to exist in order to be deceived. Nietzsche's response is essentially to ask why the demon's trickery should be assumed to stop exactly at the border Descartes drew, and not one step further in. If a demon can fool you about your body, your senses, and the entire external world, why should you trust that same suspect apparatus, introspection, run through the exact same faculties the demon has already been shown capable of corrupting, when it reports back that there's a unified I behind the doubting? Descartes stopped digging at the one spot that happened to make him feel secure. Nietzsche kept digging, and what he found underneath the floorboards was grammar, not bedrock. Think about what this means for the cogito, philosophy's supposed unshakable foundation. Descartes believed he had found one thing he could not possibly doubt: I think, therefore I am. Nietzsche's response, in effect, is you've doubted too little. You've allowed the grammar of your own sentence to dictate your metaphysics. All that observation actually licenses you to say is that thinking is occurring. That's it. That's the whole indubitable fact. The moment you add therefore I am, you have smuggled in an entire unproven theory, the theory that thinking requires a persistent, unified thinker, a subject that exists independently of the thoughts and does the thinking the way a hand does the writing. But nothing about the mere occurrence of a thought tells you that. You could just as easily say a thought is occurring, therefore a thought is occurring. The leap to I am is not a discovery. It's an act of faith, dressed up as logical necessity. Nietzsche pushes this even further in a passage that reads almost like a direct answer to the exercise we started with: before you think your next thought, try choosing what it will be. Nietzsche writes about the phenomenology of actually trying to catch thought in the act, and what he finds is that it comes on its own schedule, in its own way, following what feels from the inside like its own agenda, entirely indifferent to the wishes of the supposed thinker. This, he says, is a falsification of the facts of the case to say that the subject I is the condition of the predicate think. It thinks, but that this it is just the famous old ego is, to put it mildly, only a supposition, an assertion, and assuredly not an immediate certainty. He goes so far as to suggest that even saying it thinks is going too far, because that it already contains an interpretation of the process, and does not belong to the process itself. People are concluding here, according to grammatical habit, thinking is an activity. Every activity requires an agent who acts. Consequently what? Consequently we invent the agent because our grammar demands one, and then we mistake the grammatical requirement for a metaphysical discovery. This is, in some ways, the most extreme version of the argument we're building toward, because it doesn't just say the author is hard to find, or that the author has less control than it thinks. It says the very existence of the author is an inference from grammar, not a fact discovered through introspection. When you introspect, you find thinking. You do not find a thinker over and above the thinking, standing behind it, producing it. The I is added afterward, as an interpretation, the same way you might look at a bolt of lightning and assume there must be some agent behind it, hurling it, which is, not coincidentally, exactly the mistake Nietzsche accuses the whole philosophical and religious tradition of making about the will. We see the flash and posit a flasher. We see the thought and posit a thinker. But in both cases the positing is a habit of grammar, not an observation of fact. Nietzsche pursues this same idea into the territory of moral psychology, and it's worth following him there briefly because it sharpens the point considerably. On the genealogy of morals, he draws a famous analogy to demand of strength, that it not express itself as strength, that it not be a desire to overcome, a desire to throw down, a desire to become master, is just as absurd as to demand of weakness that it express itself as strength. He points out that popular morality separates strength from the manifestations of strength, as if there were a neutral substratum behind the strong man free to express or not express his strength, as if there were an indifferent substratum behind the lightning that was free to flash or not to flash. But, Nietzsche insists, there is no such substratum. There is no being behind doing, effecting, becoming. The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed is everything. Translate this back to thought: there is no thinker behind thinking, separable from the thinking, free to think or not think this particular thought, the way we imagine the lightning could have chosen not to flash. The thinking is not something a prior, independent thinker chooses to do. The thinking is simply what happens, and the thinker is invented afterward, exactly the way the flasher is invented to explain the flash. This is a genuinely uncomfortable place to arrive, because it means the demand embedded in Descartes' whole approach: find the one thing that cannot be doubted, and build everything else on top of it, was aimed at a target that isn't there to be found. Descartes wanted certainty about a persisting subject. What he actually had certain access to on Nietzsche's reading was only ever the occurrence of thinking, a bare event with no guarantee whatsoever that the event required or even permitted a persisting owner. The whole edifice of modern philosophy's confidence in the self as the one sure foundation turns out on this reading to have been built on an assumption about grammar mistaken for a discovery about reality, and once you see the mistake you can't quite unsee it, no matter how badly the ordinary, everyday experience of being you wants to insist otherwise. Nietzsche has a related and equally uncomfortable point to make about consciousness itself, one that widens the crack even further. In Neuroscience, he argues that consciousness, the part of the mind we identify with, the part that experiences itself as choosing and deciding and authoring, is actually a very late, very thin addition to a mental life that is overwhelmingly unconscious, and that consciousness itself only developed because human beings are social animals who needed to communicate, which meant they needed to represent their inner states to themselves in a form that could, in principle, be shared with others. Consciousness, on this view, is not the deep control room of the mind. It's closer to a press office, a small department whose job is to produce a coherent, communicable narrative about decisions that were substantially made elsewhere by processes that never report to the press office at all, and that the press office doesn't have access to. We think consciousness is the essential seat of everything mental and important, Nietzsche says, but this is precisely the great error, the fundamental error, that has bedeviled philosophy since it began, mistaking the reporter for the events being reported, mistaking the surface for the depth. Hume showed that when you look for the self behind the thoughts you find only more thoughts, and Nietzsche showed that the belief in a thinker behind the thinking is a grammatical inference rather than an observed fact. Then the next major figure in this story took the argument out of philosophy's armchair entirely and tried to build, out of clinical observation, an actual theory of where thoughts come from when they don't come from anywhere you can see. Sigmund Freud is easy to dismiss today, and there are good reasons for some of that dismissal. Plenty of his specific clinical claims have not survived contact with modern psychology, and his methods would not pass muster in a contemporary research program. But underneath the parts of Freud that haven't aged well is a structural insight that has aged extremely well, because it keeps getting independently rediscovered by neuroscience, using completely different methods decades after Freud died. The insight is this: the conscious mind, the I that experiences itself as the seat of decision-making, is not the primary agent of mental life. It is, in Freud's famous and still startling phrase, not even master in its own house. Freud's model divided the mind into layers, but the layer that matters most for our purposes is the unconscious, not unconscious in the loose popular sense of things you're not currently thinking about, but unconscious in the strong sense of a set of processes, drives, memories, and conflicts that are actively shaping your thoughts, feelings, and behavior at every moment, while being permanently and structurally inaccessible to the conscious mind doing the experiencing. On Freud's picture, the conscious I is something like a constitutional monarch who believes he rules the country, cuts ribbons, gives speeches, and takes credit for the harvest, while the actual governing, the actual decisions about policy are being made by an unelected bureaucracy operating behind closed doors, a bureaucracy the monarch has no access to and, crucially, no awareness that he lacks access to. The monarch doesn't know he's a figurehead. That's the whole trick. If he knew, the system wouldn't work the way it does. This is why Freud's model has such an eerie resonance with the intrusive thought phenomenon we started with. On the Freudian account, a thought that seems to come from nowhere, that seems totally alien to your values and your sense of yourself, is not actually coming from nowhere. It's coming from somewhere, the unconscious, but that somewhere is walled off from the conscious mind by mechanisms Freud called repression and censorship, mechanisms whose entire function is to keep certain material out of awareness precisely because it's disturbing. The thought that flashes through your mind on the train platform isn't randomly generated noise. On this view, it's a leak, a moment where the barrier between the conscious house and the unconscious machinery running underneath it gets thin enough that something slips through. The horror you feel isn't a malfunction. It's the correct response of a system encountering, briefly and without warning, a fragment of its own actual machinery it was never built to see. Freud's larger claim, and the one that matters most here, is that this is not a special or exceptional situation. It's not that most of your thoughts are authored by your conscious mind, and then occasionally, in unusual circumstances, an unconscious thought slips through the cracks. It's that virtually all of your thoughts are shaped, generated, and delivered by unconscious processes, and what you experience as conscious thinking is closer to receiving a finished product than manufacturing one. The feeling of authorship, the feeling that you are deliberately constructing your thoughts word by word, the way you'd construct a sentence you were writing by hand, is, on this view, mostly a story the conscious mind tells about a process it did not actually perform and cannot actually see. You are not the factory. You are the showroom. It's worth pointing out that Freud arrived at this conclusion from clinical evidence that has genuine staying power, even if his broader theoretical architecture had been heavily revised. Slips of the tongue, in which a person says something they didn't intend to say but which turns out on inspection to reveal something they were actively, if unconsciously, thinking. The minister who means to say "I now declare the meeting closed" and instead says "I now declare the meeting open" at the exact moment he privately, and unbeknownst even to himself, wishes the tedious proceedings would simply end. Dreams, in which entire narratives, vivid and coherent and sometimes deeply strange, are generated by a mind that its owner would swear, upon waking, had no idea what was coming, full casts of characters, entire invented cities, plot twists that surprise the very person whose brain produced them a half-second before they occur, evidence, if nothing else, that the machinery capable of generating rich, coherent, novel content operates just fine without any conscious eye standing over its shoulder directing the production. Neurotic symptoms that make no rational sense to the conscious patient but that turn out, under analysis, to be following a logic, displaced, disguised, but a logic nonetheless, that the conscious mind had no access to while it was happening. A patient who cannot explain why a particular word, a particular smell, a particular tone of voice sends her into a panic she cannot account for, until months of careful work trace the reaction back to an association her conscious mind never once considered, an association that was nonetheless doing real work, shaping real behavior, the entire time it remained invisible to her. In every one of these cases, Freud is pointing at the same basic phenomenon we keep circling back to. The mind produces far more than the conscious eye is aware of producing, and the eye mistakes the tip of the iceberg it can see for the entire iceberg. Freud gave this whole architecture a memorable image, one that has outlived most of the specific theoretical baggage attached to it. The mind as an iceberg, with the small visible portion above the waterline representing consciousness, and the vast bulk of the structure, bigger, heavier, more consequential, submerged and invisible, doing most of the actual work of keeping the thing afloat and determining which direction it drifts. The image is worth sitting with because it captures something that both Hume and Nietzsche, in their own very different vocabularies, were also gesturing at. What you experience as your mental life is not the whole of your mental life. It's a small, curated, after-the-fact display window, and behind the glass, unseen, is the machinery that actually produces what gets put in the window. Freud's later structural model, dividing the mind into id, ego, and superego, is often taught as a rigid diagram, 3 boxes stacked on top of each other, but it's more useful here as a description of a power struggle than a floor plan. The id on this model is the oldest layer, a seething mass of drives and impulses with no concept of logic, morality, or consequence, operating purely on the pleasure principle. It wants what it wants, immediately, and knows nothing of no. The superego is the internalized voice of parental and social prohibition, absorbed so early and so thoroughly that it doesn't feel like a voice at all. It feels like conscience, like simply knowing right from wrong. And the ego, caught between them, has the unenviable job of negotiating a truce, finding ways to satisfy the id's demands that the superego will tolerate and that external reality will actually permit. The ego experiences itself as in charge of this process, but Freud's whole point is that it is more often a mediator scrambling to keep up with forces it did not generate and cannot fully control, forces that started shaping it before it had the language to object. The feeling of being a coherent, deciding self is, on this account, largely the ego's own PR, a necessary and often quite successful performance of executive control, covering for negotiations that are mostly happening without its full knowledge, let alone its authorship. It's worth being clear-eyed about where Freud's specific theoretical claims have and haven't held up. The idea of a rigidly Oedipal unconscious, organized entirely around childhood sexual conflicts, has not survived contact with modern developmental psychology in anything like its original form. But the structural claim underneath it that conscious awareness is a late, partial, and heavily edited readout of processes that begin elsewhere, processes the conscious mind is not positioned to observe directly, have been picked up, independently verified, and in some ways strengthened by fields Freud never had access to. Cognitive psychology's decades of research into implicit memory and unconscious priming, in which a person's judgments and behavior can be measurably shifted by information they were never consciously aware of encountering, and, as we're about to see, neuroscience's own direct measurements of the brain in the act of producing decisions taken before those decisions ever reach the light of conscious awareness at all. For most of the 20th century, this remained a philosophical and clinical claim, persuasive to some, dismissed by others as unfalsifiable speculation dressed up in medical language. What changed things, what took this from an interesting theory to something closer to an observed fact, was the arrival of a very strange natural experiment, one that neuroscience stumbled into almost by accident, in the treatment of a condition that had nothing directly to do with philosophy at all: severe epilepsy. Starting in the late 1930s and continuing through the following decades, surgeons developed a treatment for patients with severe drug-resistant epilepsy that involved severing the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerve fibers, hundreds of millions of them, that connects the brain's left and right hemispheres and allows them to communicate. The logic was straightforward. Epileptic seizures often spread from one hemisphere to the other across this bridge, and if you cut the bridge, you could contain a seizure to one side of the brain, dramatically reducing its severity and frequency. The surgery worked remarkably well in many cases, but it also created something that had never existed before in the history of the species outside of extremely rare natural cases: human beings whose two cerebral hemispheres could no longer directly talk to each other. What researchers discovered when they studied these split-brain patients, most famously in a series of experiments led by Roger Sperry and, later, Michael Gazzaniga, is some of the strangest and most philosophically loaded data in the history of neuroscience, and it goes to the very heart of the question this whole essay has been circling. Here is the basic setup. In most people, the brain's left hemisphere controls language. The ability to speak, to produce and understand words, is heavily concentrated there, in most right-handed individuals and the large majority of left-handed ones as well. The right hemisphere, by contrast, generally lacks the capacity for speech, or has it only in a very limited form. In a person with an intact corpus callosum, this division of labor doesn't matter much in daily life because information flows freely between the hemispheres. Whatever the right hemisphere perceives, it can instantly share with the left, and the left, with its access to language, can describe it. But in a split-brain patient, that channel is gone. The two hemispheres are, in a very real sense, cut off from each other, operating as two separate information processing systems sharing one skull. Using a clever experimental setup flashing images to only the left or only the right half of a patient's visual field, which, because of how the visual system is wired, sends information exclusively to the opposite hemisphere, researchers could feed information to one half of a split-brain patient's mind without the other half knowing anything about it. And what they found was extraordinary. You could, for instance, flash the word walk to a patient's right hemisphere, the non-speaking side, and the patient would get up and start walking. Then, if you asked them why they got up, their left hemisphere, the speaking half, which had received no information about the instruction and had no idea why the body it was inhabiting had just started moving, would not say "I don't know." It would not report the honest truth, which is that it had no access to the reason. Instead, it would instantly, fluently, and with complete conviction generate an explanation. "I felt like getting a Coke," a patient might say, or "I wanted to stretch my legs." The explanation was invented, fabricated on the spot, and this is the crucial detail: the patient had no awareness whatsoever that they were fabricating anything. They believed their own explanation completely. It felt, from the inside, exactly like an authentic report of their own motives. The experiments got stranger the more elaborately researchers designed them. In one variant, researchers flash a snowy winter scene to a patient's right hemisphere and, at the same time, a chicken claw to the left hemisphere, and then asked the patient to choose, from an array of pictures visible to both hemispheres, an image that matched what they had seen. The patient's left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, pointed to a picture of a shovel, an entirely sensible match for a snow scene the right hemisphere had seen but the left hemisphere, lacking language, could not describe. The patient's right hand, controlled by the language-capable left hemisphere, pointed to a picture of a chicken, matching the claw. So far, so consistent, each hemisphere correctly matching what it alone had seen. But when the researchers asked the patient verbally why he had chosen the shovel, the left hemisphere, again, with no access whatsoever to the snow scene, which only the right hemisphere had witnessed, did not hesitate, did not express confusion, did not say "I don't know why my left hand did that." It answered instantly, "Oh, that's simple. The chicken claw goes with the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed." A complete, internally coherent, entirely wrong explanation generated on the spot to account for information the explaining system never had. And the patient, Gazzaniga reported, delivered this answer with the same casual confidence anyone uses to explain any ordinary fact about their own behavior. There was no experienced gap, no felt uncertainty, no sense of guessing. It felt, from the inside, like simply reporting the truth. Gazzaniga eventually coined a term for whatever mechanism in the left hemisphere was doing this work, and he called it the interpreter. The interpreter's job, as Gazzaniga came to understand it, is not to accurately report the causes of our behavior. Its job is to construct a coherent, plausible narrative that makes sense of whatever behavior has already occurred, using whatever fragments of information happen to be available to it, and it will do this job with total confidence, whether or not it actually has access to the real causal story. The interpreter does not know the difference between an accurate account and a confabulated one. It cannot tell. From the inside, both feel identical, both feel like simply noticing and reporting the reason you did what you did. This should stop you cold, because it is not a fringe or exotic finding confined to a handful of unusual surgical patients. Split-brain patients are a special case that makes visible, in an unusually stark and undeniable way, something researchers have since found strong evidence for in ordinary, intact brains as well, that a great deal of what feels like explaining my own reasons for doing something is actually a post hoc narrative construction process stitched together after the behavior has already occurred, using cues that may or may not have anything to do with the actual cause. The interpreter in a split-brain patient is caught red-handed only because the experimental setup allows researchers to know, with certainty, that the patient's explanation is false. They know the real cause was the word walk flashed to the silent hemisphere, and they can watch the speaking hemisphere confidently invent a completely different story and believe it. But there's no obvious reason to think the interpreter in an intact brain works any differently. It's just that in ordinary life, nobody is flashing us secret instructions to a hemisphere we can't consciously access, so we never get to catch our own interpreter in the act of confabulating. We only ever see its output, the confident, fluent, seemingly self-evident explanation, never the process that generated it, and never the moment where it might have simply made something up. This is Freud's iceberg translated into the language of split-brain neuroscience, minus all of the specific psychoanalytic apparatus about repression and childhood drives. The conscious, verbal, narrating part of the mind is not necessarily privy to the actual causes of thought and behavior. It is, instead, a story generation system, extremely good at its job, so good that it never tips its hand, so good that the stories it tells feel, from the inside, exactly like transparent reports of ground truth. You do not experience your interpreter interpreting. You experience its output as simply what happened and why. A psychologist named Daniel Wegner spent much of his career trying to work out exactly how the interpreter, or something very much like it, manages to fool intact, non-split brains just as thoroughly, every single day, without any surgery required at all. His book The Illusion of Conscious Will lays out a theory that has become one of the central frameworks for thinking about this problem, and it starts from an observation almost embarrassing in its simplicity. The feeling that you willed an action, Wegner argues, is not a direct readout of the causal process that actually produced the action. It is itself a separate mental event produced by its own separate mechanism, and, crucially, that mechanism can be fooled, decoupled from the actual causal chain, in carefully documented and repeatable ways. Wegner proposed that the felt experience of conscious will arises reliably whenever three conditions are met, regardless of whether your thought actually caused the action in question. The first is priority. The thought about the action has to occur shortly before the action itself, not simultaneously, not after. The second is consistency. The content of the thought has to be compatible with the action that follows. If you think about raising your arm and then your leg moves instead, the feeling of having willed the movement collapses. The third is exclusivity. There has to be no other obvious, salient cause of the action available to your attention. When a thought precedes an action, is consistent with that action, and no other cause is competing for the credit, you experience yourself as having willed it, and this experience, Wegner showed again and again in the laboratory, can be produced even when the thought demonstrably did not cause the action, and can be suppressed even when the thought demonstrably did. The clearest illustration of this comes from a phenomenon Wegner studied closely: facilitated communication, a now discredited technique once used with nonverbal individuals, in which a facilitator would support the hand of the person supposedly communicating, guiding a pointer toward letters on a board. Facilitators reported, with total sincerity, that they were merely providing physical support while the disabled person did the actual communicating. Controlled testing revealed again and again that the words being spelled out were coming from the facilitator, not the person they were supposedly assisting. The facilitators were unconsciously guiding the movements themselves, while experiencing, with complete conviction, the sense that someone else's will was doing the work. This is the interpreter phenomenon in reverse, not a person disowning their own causally effective action and inventing a false explanation for it, but a person actually causing an action while experiencing themselves as a passive conduit for someone else's will entirely. The feeling of who is willing what turns out to be shockingly detachable from the facts of who is actually causing what. Wegner ran a more controlled, laboratory version of this same disconnect in an experiment often called the I Spy study. 2 participants, actually 1 participant and 1 confederate working with the experimenter, sat together, each with a hand resting on a small platform that could move a cursor over a board covered in small objects, the kind used in the game I Spy. Periodically, a recorded voice would speak words into the participants' headphones, sometimes naming an object on the board just before the cursor happened to stop on it. When this happened, participants reported a strong feeling that they themselves had intentionally guided the cursor to that object, even though the actual movement, unbeknownst to them, was being steered by the confederate the entire time. Hearing a word that matched the outcome shortly before the outcome occurred was enough to generate a vivid, sincere sense of having caused something the participant, in fact, had no causal role in producing whatsoever. The feeling of willing was manufactured out of nothing but well-timed correlation. Put Wagner's theory next to the split brain interpreter and something clarifying happens. Gazzaniga showed that the mind will confidently narrate a cause it never witnessed. Wagner showed that the mind will confidently feel it caused an outcome it never actually caused, purely on the basis of timing and thematic fit, with no access to and seemingly no interest in the actual causal chain underneath. Both point at the same underlying architecture. The feeling of authorship is generated by a monitoring system that tracks correlations between thought and outcome, and infers causation from those correlations, the same way any of us might infer that the rooster caused the sunrise because it always crows right before. The feeling is usually right in the ordinary run of things because your thoughts usually are closely correlated with your actions in the way the inference assumes. But usually right is a very different thing from directly perceiving the truth, and the gap between the two is exactly where every experiment in this essay has managed to drive a wedge. If split brain research showed that the conscious mind can confidently narrate causes it did not actually witness, and Wagner's work showed that the feeling of having willed an action can be generated or suppressed almost independently of whether a thought actually caused that action, the next major body of evidence went even further and asked a more pointed question: what happens when you look, using real-time measurements of brain activity, at the moment a decision is actually made, not a decision about why you got up and walked, but a simple, voluntary, everyday decision, the kind philosophers have always assumed sits at the very core of free will. What happens if you catch the decision in the act? This is the question that a physiologist named Benjamin Libet set out to answer in a series of experiments beginning in the early 1980s, experiments that have gone on to become some of the most discussed, most contested, and most genuinely unsettling findings in the entire field of consciousness research. Libet's basic setup was elegantly simple. He asked participants to perform a trivial voluntary action, flicking their wrist for instance, at a moment entirely of their own choosing, with no external cue telling them when to do it. While they did this, he measured two things simultaneously. First, using electrodes on the scalp, he measured a well-documented pattern of brain activity called the readiness potential, a slow build-up of electrical activity in the brain's motor areas that had long been known to precede voluntary movement. Second, he asked participants to watch a fast-moving clock and report, as precisely as they could, the exact moment they became consciously aware of their decision, their felt intention to move. What Libet found was this: the readiness potential, the brain activity associated with preparing to move, began, on average, several hundred milliseconds before participants reported becoming consciously aware of having decided to move. The brain, in other words, appeared to be gearing up to act before the conscious mind had, by its own report, made the decision to act. The unconscious preparation came first. The conscious experience of deciding came after, trailing the actual neural initiation of the movement by a small but measurable and highly consistent gap. The implications of this finding, if taken at face value, are enormous, and they go to the absolute center of what this whole essay has been building toward. If the brain has already begun preparing an action before you're consciously aware of deciding to perform it, then the conscious decision, the felt experience of I am choosing to do this now, cannot be the actual cause of the action. It's not driving the train. At best, it's a passenger who becomes aware of the train's motion slightly after the train has already started moving, and who then experiences that awareness as though it were the moment of departure. Libet himself was cautious about the interpretation, and it's worth being cautious too, because this experiment has been picked apart, refined, and debated for over 40 years, and the picture is more complicated than the headline version suggests. Critics have pointed out that the readiness potential might not represent a specific decision to move at all, but rather a general rise in neural noise or preparatory activity that only sometimes crystallizes into an actual movement, a kind of background hum of possible action, out of which one action occasionally gets selected, rather than a dedicated signal for this particular movement. Others have questioned how precisely people can actually introspect and report the timing of an inner experience, like deciding, given that the very act of monitoring a clock and trying to timestamp an internal event is itself a strange and artificial task, not something minds evolved to do. Libet himself, notably, tried to preserve some role for conscious will, suggesting that even if the initiation of an action happens unconsciously, consciousness might retain a kind of veto power, the ability to consciously block an action that's already been unconsciously prepared, in the brief window between preparation and execution. He called this, memorably, free want rather than free will, not the power to originate an action, but the power to stop one that's already underway. But even with all of these caveats, even granting every reasonable objection, something significant survives, and it's been reinforced rather than undermined by later research. In 2008, a team led by John Dylan Haynes, working with Chun Seong-soon and colleagues, used functional MRI, which allows researchers to look at brain activity with much greater spatial detail than Libet's scalp electrodes could achieve, and found something that pushed the timeline even further back. In Haynes's experiments, participants were asked to freely decide, at a moment of their choosing, whether to press a button with their left or right hand, while continuously watching a stream of letters and later reporting which letter was on screen at the moment they felt they had decided. By training a pattern classification algorithm on activity in the prefrontal and parietal cortex regions involved in higher-level planning and decision-making, not just the motor cortex's job of actually executing movement, the researchers found they could predict which hand a participant was going to choose at above chance accuracy up to 7 to 10 seconds before the participant reported being consciously aware of having made the decision. The accuracy wasn't perfect, it hovered somewhere in the range of 55 to 60%, well above the 50% you'd expect from pure chance on a binary choice, but nowhere near the confident certainty of a mind-reading machine. Still, 7 to 10 seconds is an enormous gap in the context of a simple binary choice. That's not the brain gearing up a fraction of a second ahead of conscious awareness, the way Libet's readiness potential arguably was. That's a decision-relevant signal sitting in the brain, encoding information about a choice the person has not yet consciously made an entire eternity before the person experiences themselves as making it, long enough, in the researcher's own framing, that an entirely separate, unrelated thought could occur in the intervening gap. It's worth taking the objections to this line of research as seriously as the findings themselves, because the temptation to overclaim here is real, and careful thinkers on both sides have pushed back hard over the past 2 decades. Some critics argue that what the readiness potential and the Haynes-style decoding actually capture is not a hidden decision at all, but a slow drift of background neural noise, random fluctuations in activity that happen to bias the system toward one outcome or another whenever a choice is genuinely arbitrary and unconstrained, the way a coin balanced on its edge will eventually fall in whichever direction a passing breeze happens to be blowing. On this reading, there isn't a secret unconscious decision-maker hiding behind the curtain making the real choice while consciousness merely rubber stamps it afterward. There's just noise tipping an already unstable system one way rather than the other, and consciousness catching up to register the outcome once the tipping has occurred. Other researchers have questioned the introspective reports at the heart of both paradigms, asking someone to watch a rotating clock hand or a stream of letters and pinpoint the exact millisecond they became aware of an inner urge is a strange and artificial demand, one with no guarantee that people can perform it accurately, and some of the apparent gap between brain activity and conscious awareness may be an artifact of this measurement problem rather than a real temporal lag between two separate events. These are legitimate objections, and it would be intellectually dishonest to present the Libet and Haynes findings as a closed case and an ambiguous proof that free will is a fiction filed away with certainty in a drawer somewhere in a neuroscience lab. But notice what even the most skeptical, most deflationary interpretation of this research still concedes: whatever is happening in that gap between brain activity and conscious report, it is not a story in which a unified, deliberating I surveys the options, weighs them, and then issues a command that the rest of the brain obediently executes, with consciousness present and in charge at every step. Even on the noise of fluctuation account, the outcome is being settled by processes, however humble, however probabilistic, however far from the classical philosophical image of a reasoning subject, that are not the thing you experience as deciding. The decision, or the drift toward a decision, is happening in the machinery. The feeling of deciding is arriving as a report about the machinery, sometimes well after the machinery has already tipped its hand. Whether you call that machinery noise or the real unconscious cause barely matters for the purposes of this essay, because either way, the conscious I turns out to be downstream of a process it does not directly perceive happening. Sit with that for a second, because it deserves more than a passing mention. A machine, looking only at patterns of blood flow in your brain, could, with real, above chance, statistically robust accuracy tell you which button you were about to press seconds before you yourself had any idea. The information about your choice existed in your own brain before the thing you call you, the conscious, deciding, choosing self, had access to it. Whatever was doing the actual choosing, it was not waiting around for conscious permission. It had already settled the matter and was simply waiting for the rest of the system, including the part of you that experiences itself as the decider, to catch up and receive the memo. This is not a claim that your choices are random or meaningless, or that some external force is controlling you like a puppet. That would be a different and much less interesting claim. The claim these experiments actually support is stranger and more intimate than that. The process that generates your decisions is a process you, the conscious experiencer, do not have front row access to. You get the output. You get the finished decision delivered to consciousness, often accompanied by a vivid and completely convincing feeling that you are, right now, in this very moment, in the act of choosing. But the choosing, in whatever sense that word still means anything after these experiments, appears to have already happened somewhere below the waterline, in exactly the territory Freud pointed to with his iceberg, exactly the territory Nietzsche pointed to when he insisted that it thinks rather than I think, exactly the territory Hume pointed to when he searched for the self and found only the parade of perceptions, never the reviewer's stand from which the parade was supposedly being watched and directed. There's a further wrinkle worth adding here, because it deepens the puzzle rather than resolving it. Even setting aside the timing debates entirely, there is a separate and quite robust body of research into what psychologists call choice blindness, pioneered by Peter Johansson and Lars Hall, which shows that people are often unable to detect when the outcome of their own choice have been covertly switched, and will confidently generate detailed, confident justifications for a choice they did not actually make. In one of the best-known versions of this experiment, participants were shown pairs of photographs of faces and asked to pick which one they found more attractive. Using a simple magician's trick, a double-backed card, the experimenter would occasionally hand the participant the photograph they had rejected, telling them it was the one they had chosen. In a striking majority of these manipulated trials, participants failed to notice the switch at all, and when asked to explain why they'd chosen the face they had actually just rejected, they produced fluent, confident, detailed reasons. She seemed friendlier, I like her earrings, something about his smile, for a preference that was never theirs to begin with. The reasons felt completely genuine to the people producing them. There was no experienced gap, no sense of confusion or dissonance, just a smooth, confident account of a choice that had, in fact, been secretly reversed. This is choice blindness's version of the split brain interpreter, produced without any surgery, without any unusual patient population, in ordinary university students walking past a table in a shopping mall. Further evidence that the sense of having reasoned your way to a preference is separable, cleanly and repeatably, from the actual causal history of that preference. Notice how many completely independent lines of evidence have now converged on the same basic shape. A philosopher in the 1730s, working with nothing but careful introspection, concludes that whenever he looks for the self, he only ever finds perceptions, never a perceiver standing apart from them. A philosopher in the 1880s, attacking the grammar of Descartes' most famous sentence, concludes that the belief in a thinking I behind our thoughts is an unearned inference smuggled in by the structure of language rather than delivered by honest observation. A clinician in early 20th century Vienna, working from dreams and slips of the tongue and the strange, displaced logic of neurotic symptoms, concludes that the conscious mind is a kind of constitutional monarch presiding over a country actually governed from somewhere it cannot see. A generation of neuroscientists studying patients whose brain hemispheres have been surgically separated catch the conscious, verbal mind in the act of confidently inventing explanations for behavior it did not actually cause and had no access to, and find that it does this so smoothly, so convincingly, that the patient cannot tell the difference between an honest report and a total fabrication. And a final generation of researchers using electrodes and then fMRI scanners find that the neural signature of a decision, even a trivial one, even one as simple as which button to press, is present and to some degree predictable before the conscious experience of deciding arrives, sometimes by whole seconds. None of these thinkers were working from the other's conclusions, at least not in any straightforward chain of influence. Hume didn't know about split-brain patients. Freud wasn't running fMRI studies. Libet wasn't citing Nietzsche. Johansen and Hall weren't trying to vindicate an 18th-century Scottish philosopher when they swapped photographs of faces on a table in a shopping mall. And yet they all arrived from radically different starting points and using radically different methods, separated in some cases by more than 2 centuries, at something like the same destination. The felt sense of being the conscious author of your own thoughts and decisions is a compelling, persistent, extremely well-constructed user interface sitting on top of a much larger, much older, much less accessible set of processes that are doing most of the actual work, out of view before the interface ever lights up to tell you what you decided. There is something almost suspicious about that degree of convergence, in the best possible sense of the word suspicious. When a philosopher's armchair introspection, a clinician's dream analysis, a neurosurgeon's accidental natural experiment, a psychologist's rigged magic trick, and a neuroscientist's brain scanner all point toward the same conclusion, using none of each other's methods and answerable to none of each other's disciplinary standards, that's not the kind of agreement you'd expect from 5 different groups of people, each independently fooling themselves in 5 different ways. Independent errors tend to scatter in different directions, the way 5 broken clocks rarely agree on the same wrong time. Independent confirmations, on the other hand, tend to cluster around something real. This doesn't prove the case beyond the possibility of revision. Good science is never beyond the possibility of revision, and every single study named in this essay had been challenged, refined, or partially overturned by later work, which is exactly how a healthy field is supposed to behave. But it does mean the burden of proof has shifted. The default picture, the one you probably walked into this essay holding without ever having examined it, the picture of a unified self sitting in a control room, generating thoughts on command, that picture is now the one that needs defending, not the one you're allowed to assume by default while treating everything else as the burden of an eccentric minority. It's worth being honest about what this does and doesn't mean, because it would be easy at this point to slide into a kind of nihilistic overreach that the evidence doesn't actually support. None of this means your thoughts don't matter, or that you don't exist in any meaningful sense, or that you should stop taking responsibility for your actions, or that deliberation is pointless theater. The picture that's emerging from all these different directions is more subtle than that, and honestly more interesting. It's not that there's no thinking going on. There's clearly an enormous amount of extraordinarily sophisticated processing happening, evaluating options, weighing outcomes, integrating memory and emotion and long-term goals, arriving at conclusions that are, by any reasonable standard, intelligent and often quite wise. The question these thinkers and these experiments are all raising isn't whether thinking happens. It's whether the you that experiences itself as the author of that thinking is the same thing as the process that's actually doing it, or whether you, the conscious, narrating, deciding, feeling self, might instead be something more like a very sophisticated summary, a report generated after the fact or in parallel by a system that reads out the results of a deeper process and dresses them up in the felt sense of having been chosen on purpose by an I standing at the center of it all. This is, if you let it actually land, one of the strangest things it's possible to notice about your own existence, because it doesn't require you to accept anything on faith or take anyone else's word for it. You can run the experiment yourself, right now, the same experiment we opened with. Try to catch the moment before your next thought. Try to find the chooser, standing in the gap, weighing which thought to admit next into consciousness, the way a bouncer weighs who gets into the club. You won't find him. You'll find the previous thought, and then, with no visible seam, the next one, arriving complete, arriving already dressed for the occasion, arriving with no fingerprints on it except the retroactive fingerprints your narrating mind will apply a half-second later, when it tells itself, and you, the comforting story that all of this was chosen on purpose by someone in charge. Buddhist philosophy arrived at a strikingly similar conclusion nearly 2,500 years before Hume ever picked up a pen, though it took the observation somewhere Western philosophy has generally been reluctant to follow it. The doctrine of anatta, usually translated as non-self, holds that what we take to be a permanent, unified self is in fact a constantly shifting bundle of 5 aggregates: physical form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness itself, none of which, examined closely, contains anything that could be called a fixed, essential I. This is not a claim that nothing is happening. It's a claim, remarkably close to Hume's, that what's happening is a process, not a thing, a flow of arising and passing mental events with no unchanging owner standing behind the flow directing traffic. Where a great deal of Western philosophy, faced with this same observation, has tended to recoil from it, or explain it away, or search harder for the self that must surely be hiding somewhere just out of view, a significant strand of Buddhist thought simply accepted the finding and asked a different question: if there's no fixed self doing the thinking, what follows from that practically, for how a person might live? The suffering that comes from clinging to thoughts as mine, clinging to the story of a continuous self that must be defended and enhanced and protected from insult, might be less a fact about the universe forcing itself on you and more a symptom of a mistaken belief about what you are, a belief so deeply built into ordinary experience that unlearning it can take a lifetime of sustained attention. You don't have to adopt any particular metaphysical or religious framework to notice that this converges from a completely different tradition on the same basic territory Hume and Nietzsche and Freud and the split-brain researchers and the Libet-style neuroscientists all eventually arrived at from the West. Look closely at the mind, using whatever tools are available to you: careful introspection, clinical observation, split visual fields, EEG electrodes, functional imaging, or 2 millennia of meditative practice, and the tidy, unified, continuously authoring self keeps failing to show up where you'd expect to find it. What shows up instead is process perceptions succeeding each other, thoughts arising and passing, decisions crystallizing in neural tissue before they crystallize in awareness, explanations being generated with total confidence for causes the explainer never actually witnessed. What's especially notable about the Buddhist framework for the purposes of this essay is that it doesn't stop at the diagnosis the way Western philosophy has often tended to. Hume, having made his devastating observation about the bundle, more or less shrugged and moved on, famously admitting in an appendix to his own treatise that he found himself entangled in such a labyrinth on this question that he could neither render his earlier account of personal identity fully consistent, nor renounce it, a rare and honest moment of a great philosopher confessing that he had broken something he did not know how to fully repair. Nietzsche, for his part, tended to treat the collapse of the unified subject less as a problem to be solved than as a fact to be affirmed with a kind of grim, aristocratic relish, an invitation to stop moralizing about a self that was never really there to be praised or blamed in the first place. The contemplative traditions, by contrast, developed an entire technology of sustained attention aimed specifically at this gap, meditative practices designed to let a person watch the arising and passing of mental events directly, over years of repetition, until the habitual, automatic sense of a fixed watcher behind the watching begins to loosen on its own, not through argument but through repeated direct observation. Whether or not you find that practice appealing or its further metaphysical claims persuasive, the convergence is worth noting one more time. An introspective tradition operating in near-total isolation from Enlightenment Europe identified the same basic architecture process without a fixed processor arising, without an author standing behind the arising, and instead of treating it purely as an epistemological puzzle, treated it as a fact with direct consequences for how a life driven by clinging to a fictional self might be causing suffering that a more accurate picture could relieve. So where does this leave the question we started with, not just where thoughts come from, but what it means, if anything, to call yourself their author? One tempting response is to conclude that the self is simply an illusion, full stop, a useless fiction that a sufficiently rigorous mind should discard the way it discards a belief in astrology. But this response moves too fast, and it misunderstands what an illusion actually is in this context. An illusion, properly understood, is not the same as a non-existent thing. When you look at a visual illusion, two lines that appear to be different lengths but are actually identical, the illusion is real. Something is genuinely happening in your visual system that produces the mistaken appearance of unequal length. The lines aren't unequal, but the experience of their apparent inequality is a real, physical, reliably reproducible event. In the same way, the sense of being a unified, continuous author of your own thoughts might not correspond to some metaphysical fact about a soul-like entity steering the ship from a control room. But the sense itself, the feeling of ownership, of continuity, of I did this, I thought this, I chose this, is a real and extraordinarily important feature of how a human mind organizes itself, plans for the future, learns from the past, and coordinates with other minds in a social world that runs almost entirely on the currency of people being held responsible for what they say and do. This is, in a sense, exactly what Nietzsche was pointing to when he suggested that consciousness developed for the purposes of communication. A creature that can represent its own mental states to itself in a coherent, narratable form, even if that representation is a simplified, after-the-fact summary rather than a transparent window onto the actual machinery, gains an enormous advantage. It can explain itself to others. It can be trusted or distrusted based on a track record. It can make promises and be held to them. It can build a reputation, form alliances, punish betrayal, coordinate complex social behavior across long stretches of time. None of this requires that the summary be perfectly accurate about its own causal origins. It only requires that the summary be stable enough and coherent enough to function as a kind of social and psychological anchor, a story about who I am solid enough to plan a life around, even if the story is, at the level of raw neural mechanics, being assembled well below the surface out of materials the narrator never sees arriving. Nietzsche makes this point explicitly, and it deserves to be quoted at slightly greater length than it usually is because the argument is doing more work than the famous soundbite version suggests. He proposes that consciousness has developed only under the pressure of the need for communication, that it is from the start only necessary and useful between human beings, between those who command and those who obey, and that it has developed only in proportion to the degree of that necessity. Consciousness, on this account, is really only a net of communication between human beings, and it is only as such a net that it had to develop, refining itself in tandem with language, which grew up alongside it for exactly the same social reasons. From this Nietzsche draws a conclusion that anticipates the interpreter and the confabulation research by more than a century. Whatever becomes conscious becomes, by that very fact, shallow, thin, comparatively stupid, general, a sign, a herd mark, because consciousness has to be translatable into the shared, simplified currency of a social species, which means it can never be a direct, unfiltered readout of the actual complexity happening underneath. The deep processing stays deep precisely because it doesn't need to be shared, and the part that surfaces into conscious awareness is not the important, causally load-bearing part, it's the part built for export. It helps here to think about what an illusion of this particular kind is actually doing for the organism that has it, because evolution doesn't build elaborate, metabolically expensive features for no reason, and a brain that manufactures a persistent, false sense of unified authorship, running continuously day after day for an entire lifespan, is a very expensive feature to build by accident. One plausible answer hinted at by Nietzsche's remarks about consciousness and communication, and developed at length by later cognitive science, is that the sense of a unified self is less a discovery about how minds actually work internally and more a tool for predicting and controlling behavior at a level of description that's actually useful. You do not need to know the truth about the trillions of synaptic events happening in your cortex at any given moment in order to plan your day, keep a promise, or explain yourself to a friend. What you need is a compressed, stable, low-resolution model, a character, essentially, with consistent traits, memories, and preferences that can stand in for the underlying complexity and be reasoned about efficiently by you and by everyone you interact with. The self, on this account, functions something like the icons on a computer desktop. The little folder icon does not resemble anything that's actually happening inside the machine at the level of transistors and voltage, and if you tried to operate the computer by directly manipulating electrons instead of clicking icons, you would never get anything done. The icon is a useful fiction, engineered by evolution and culture rather than by a corporation, standing in for a reality too complex to be handled directly, and functioning perfectly well as a fiction for as long as nobody asks it to also serve as an accurate wiring diagram. There's something almost vertiginous about holding both of these truths at once, that the felt sense of authorship may not correspond to how thoughts actually get produced, and that the felt sense of authorship is nonetheless doing real, indispensable work in your life. It would be a mistake to respond to everything in this essay by concluding that responsibility is fake, that deliberation is pointless, that you might as well stop trying to think carefully about your choices because you weren't really the one making them anyway. That conclusion doesn't follow, and it isn't supported by any of the thinkers or any of the experiments we've walked through. Even Libet, having produced the single most radical piece of evidence in this whole story, held onto the idea of a conscious veto, the possibility that even if the origination of an impulse happens below the threshold of awareness, something meaningful might still occur in the narrow window where a thought, having arrived, gets endorsed or interrogated or refused. Even if you don't author the first draft, there may still be an editor, and the editing may be where whatever freedom you have actually lives. This matters enormously for how we think about responsibility, and it's worth being precise here rather than reaching for an easy conclusion in either direction. It would be a mistake to say that because the origin of a thought is hidden from consciousness, a person can never be responsible for what they do with that thought once it arrives. Responsibility, on reflection, was probably never really about authorship in the deep metaphysical sense this essay has been chasing anyway. It was always more plausibly about something closer to Libet's proposed veto, the capacity, however it's actually implemented in the brain, to receive an impulse, hold it briefly in some kind of working space, evaluate it against memory, values, consequences, and the interests of other people, and then either act on it or not. That capacity looks, from everything the evidence suggests, entirely real and entirely intact, even after every argument in this essay has been granted in full. What has been undermined is not the existence of that evaluative process, but the story that a fixed sovereign I was the one running it from some privileged, self-transparent vantage point outside the machinery. The evaluating is still happening. It's just happening the same way the generating happens, inside a system you do not have a window into, using materials and rules you did not choose and cannot fully inspect, arriving at outputs you experience once again, mostly as they land, rather than as they appeal. This also reframes what practices like meditation, therapy, and even ordinary reflective habits like journaling are actually accomplishing, and why people who take them seriously tend to report something real happening as a result, even without buying into any of the more exotic metaphysical claims that sometimes accompany them. If the conscious mind is not the author of thoughts but something closer to their first reader, then what these practices are training is not the generation of better thoughts on command. Nobody has ever managed to simply will themselves into having only wise, calm, generous thoughts, and the entire history of failed New Year's resolutions is a monument to how badly that approach fails. What they train, instead, is the quality of the reading, the capacity to notice a thought arriving, recognize it as one candidate among many rather than as an unquestionable directive from the true self, and respond with something other than immediate, automatic identification. A person who has spent years training this capacity does not report having fewer intrusive, unwanted, or irrational thoughts arrive. The arrival, all the evidence in this essay suggests, is simply not under that kind of direct voluntary control. What changes is the relationship to the arrival, less fusion, less instant conscription of every passing thought into the story of who I am, more of a gap in which the thought can be seen clearly for exactly what it is before being acted upon or dismissed. But the honest response to everything Hume, Nietzsche, Freud, the split-brain researchers, Wigner, the choice blindness researchers, and the neuroscientists of decision have shown us cannot be a simple return to the naive picture we started with, the picture of a unified I sitting in a control room, generating thoughts on command the way a novelist generates sentences. That picture doesn't survive careful introspection, and it doesn't survive careful measurement. What survives, instead, is something stranger and, if you let it be, more interesting, a mind that produces thought and action through processes largely hidden from the very consciousness that experiences the results, a consciousness that specializes not in generating content from scratch but in receiving it, narrating it, and crucially, sometimes, in that narrow window after arrival and before action, doing something with it. Watching it, questioning it, occasionally, with great effort and no guarantee of success, declining to follow where it leads. Go back one more time to the exercise we started with. Before you think your next thought, try choosing what it will be. You already know, now, in a way you may not have known at the start of this, exactly what will happen when you try. Nothing you specify in advance will show up on command. Something else will show up instead, unannounced, already finished, and a half-second later the part of you that narrates will step in and claim it, the way a monarch claims credit for a harvest grown by people he never met, working land he has never once set foot on. Consider, one last time, what it would actually mean to answer that question honestly, without flinching away from it and without overcorrecting into despair. It does not mean there is nothing here. Something is unmistakably happening, a vast, intricate, largely dark process running continuously beneath a small lit window, producing thought after thought after thought, decade after decade, with a consistency and a coherence that no random process could ever manage. Whatever that process is, it has a history shaped by your particular genes, your particular upbringing, the particular accidents and choices and relationships that make up a particular life, none of which any other mind on the planet has lived through in exactly the same combination. In that sense, the thoughts arriving in your consciousness are not generic. They are not interchangeable with the thoughts arriving in anyone else's. They are, unmistakably, the product of a system that is yours in every sense except the one sense you originally assumed. They are not the product of a little sovereign self sitting above the system, pulling the levers on purpose. They are the system, working, the only way a system like this has ever been able to work, which is to say largely in the dark, presenting its conclusions to a small, late-arriving observer who mistakes the presentation for the process. Maybe that is close enough to authorship to deserve the name after all. Maybe the mistake was never in calling yourself the thinker. Maybe the mistake was in imagining that the thinker had to look like a novelist at a writing desk, deliberate and transparent to itself, choosing every word before it lands on the page. No novelist actually works that way either, if you ask the good ones. Ideas arrive to them too, unbidden, out of a process they cannot see and would struggle to describe, and they call the finished book theirs anyway, not because they watched themselves write every sentence on purpose, but because the whole strange, largely unconscious operation that produced it happened nowhere else but inside them, shaped by nothing else but the entire particular history of being them. Perhaps that's what you are, not the author standing outside the text, pen in hand, in full command of every word before it's written, but something closer to the text itself, continuously being written by a process with your name on it and no one else's, a process you did not choose and cannot fully see, and yet somehow, against every expectation you started this with, still unmistakably, irreducibly you. And still, none of that quite dissolves the original vertigo, because a text does not get to feel like an author while it's being written, and you do. Every single time a thought arrives, it will keep arriving dressed in that same old costume, the costume that says, I made this, I chose this, I am the one thinking this thought right now. You will believe it again in about half a second, the same way you believed it a half second before you started reading this sentence, the same way you will believe it a half second after you finish it. The evidence will not stop the costume from working. It was never designed to be removable from the inside. So here is the question again, the one this whole essay has done nothing but slowly walk you toward and has no intention of answering for you if you don't choose which thoughts appear, if the mind that assembles them operates behind a threshold you cannot cross, on a timeline you cannot access, using materials you never see selected, then in what sense exactly are you the thinker at all?